Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's episode is a live recording that took place this week at the Regent Street Cinema in London. I'm talking to the writer and broadcaster Misha Glenny, newly installed as the host of Radio 4's In Our Time, about his favourite film, The Third Man, directed by Carol Reed, written by Graham Greene, starring, among others, Orson Welles, and set in post-war Vienna, a city with as many layers as the film itself. As always, we realise that this is a conversation recorded directly after a screening, and many of the people listening to this will never have seen The Third Man. In the cinema, there were quite a few people who'd never seen it before, and there were some people who had seen it more than 30 times. If you've never seen it or saw it a long time ago and need a reminder, I'm just going to sketch out what the film is about so that you know some of the references in this conversation. It is a film whose central character is called Harry Lime. The famous theme of the film is known as the Harry Lime theme. And yet, notoriously, Harry Lime, as played by Orson Welles, is only on screen for about 15 minutes, if that, in a film that is 1 hour, 45 minutes long, and he only first appears well over halfway through the film. For the first part of the film, Harry Lime is effectively a ghost. It looks like it is the story of a man called Holly Martins who has arrived in Vienna, 1948 Vienna, when the film was shot, was released in 1949, looking for his friend Harry Lime, who's invited him to come to the city, ostensibly, we discover later on in the film, to help him write copy for a medical charity that he runs. Holly Martins is a writer of pulp fiction, of westerns, so he's a slightly unlikely person for that role, but he is an old childhood friend of Harry Lime, though they haven't seen each other since before the war. And Holly discovers, early on, that Harry Lime is dead. Holly, played by Joseph Cotten, who is on screen much, much more than Orson Welles, though people tend to remember this as an Orson Welles film, spends the first half of the movie trying to find out what happened to his friend. He's told that Harry Lime was killed in a car accident, and he talks to the witnesses of the accident, including the concierge of the apartment where Harry Lime lived. And nothing really adds up. He talks to all sorts of sinister figures who knew his friend, one called Colonel Kurtz, an even more sinister one called Dr. Winkel, a Romanian called Popescu. He talks to Harry Lime's girlfriend, a woman called Anna Schmidt, who has been living in Vienna on false papers and is terrified of being picked up and deported by the Russians. He meets a British Army police officer, played by Trevor Howard, a man called Calloway, as he says to Harry Lime, Calloway, not Callahan. Do you think I'm Irish? A stiff upper lip British gentleman who's also looking for Harry Lime, because it turns out that his old friend was a racketeer. He was a kind of gangster. And the particular racket that he was running was a trade in black market penicillin. But it turns out to be even worse than that. As Holly Martins discovers from Calloway, the penicillin was diluted. It was laced with adulterants. And it was given, among others, to children suffering from meningitis. And Calloway says the lucky ones died. Later in the film, Holly Martins is taken to one of the children's wards in Vienna. And we don't see the children in the cots. We only see Martins and Calloway looking into the cots. And at one point, Calloway says, "It's a shame, isn't it?" Giving that word shame all the way to stiff upper lip Englishmen can. Something terrible has happened to these children. The lucky ones died. But it also turns out that Harry Lime is not dead. In his investigations, Holly Martins discovers that there was a third man at the scene of the accident. Initially, he's told 2 of Lime's friends were there, and they carried the body across the road. He was knocked down by his own driver. Walking past was his own doctor. Nothing about this adds up. But then the concierge of the apartment says, actually, there were 3 men who carried the body across the road. So who was the third man? The third man was Harry Lime. He was not the one knocked down. And when Calloway discovers this and discovers that Martins has seen Harry Lime, glimpsed him for a moment, they dig up the coffin, and in the coffin they find not Lime, but the orderly of a Vienna hospital, the man, they discover, has been selling the black market penicillin. And then the film becomes a question of loyalty, friendship, trust, and betrayal. Who will give up Harry Lime? Will Anna, his girlfriend, give him up? Turns out the answer is no. Will his old friend Holly give him up? It turns out the answer to that question is yes. But before it happens, the most famous scene in the film takes place on a Ferris wheel in the Russian district of Vienna. Holly Martins and Harry Lime meet, and they take a circle or two of the wheel. It only lasts for 10 minutes, if that, so it's probably just one go round. And they talk about life and death and morality and God and friendship and betrayal. And at the end of it, Orson Welles gives a very short little coda to the conversation, which is the most famous bit of the film. He talks about, as I will be talking to Misha about in this conversation, the cuckoo clock and the Borgias. If you've seen the film, you'll know exactly what I mean. Once Holly has given Harry Lime up, the film ends with a chase through the sewers of Vienna, the underground rivers of Vienna, and much of it was shot on location, but not all of the film, as you'll hear in a moment, was shot on location. And in the end, it finishes, as you might guess, with the death of Harry Lime. In this conversation with Misha Glenny, we are going to talk about some aspects of that plot. We're going to talk about the characters, but we're also talking about the city, Vienna. This is a film that could only have been made in Vienna. And we're also talking about another cast of characters, not the characters in the film, but the characters who made the film and are, in many ways, even more interesting. Misha, you told me beforehand that you've seen that film 30 times, 35 times. What keeps drawing you back?
Well, I love Vienna. I have lived in Vienna in total for about 12 years. My last stint finished really at the end of last month. I've been in Vienna for 4 years. I have, since a very young age, been obsessed by the Cold War in Germany and in Austria. And so this film speaks to me in so many ways, I don't know where to begin.
Well, let's start with Vienna. It is a quintessentially Viennese film. You couldn't imagine it being set anywhere else. It wouldn't work if it was set in Berlin. Berlin, in theory, could be the setting for this. You have the occupied city, you have the international police and so on, but this has to be Vienna. Why Vienna?
Well, it's actually slightly different from Berlin because Berlin, in 1945, was divided into 4 zones. Vienna was divided into 4 zones, but in the middle there was the international zone where all 4 powers held jurisdiction, and that's where most of the action takes place. There was also an interesting thing is that the British zone outside of the international zone dissected 2 Russian zones, which was not the case in Berlin. The other thing about Vienna, 2 things which one needs to know about it historically, is that, first of all, the Allies were trying to split Germany from Austria after the Second World War. And so they had done a deal in 1944, whereby they agreed that Austria would be determined as the first victim of Nazism. And Berlin and Germany was the responsible power. And this meant that they had a different approach to Austria than they had to Germany. And the other thing was that Austria had traditionally been the city of spies. This is a center of espionage and had been since the first major surveillance event of the modern period, which was the Congress of Vienna in 1815. and it was riddled with spies also in 1945 to 1948. Now, this film is shot in 1948 during the height of a Cold War crisis, which is the Berlin airlift. Many of the key figures who made this film were involved with intelligence. Graham Greene, who wrote it, was involved with intelligence. He was a member of the SIS from 1941 to 1944. Alexander Korda, who was the producer of the film, London Films, he had been working with British and American intelligence really since the early 30s and throughout the war. If you see the titles at the beginning, there's on the second or third title screen, there's somebody called Austrian advisor, Elizabeth Montagu. She was the daughter of the Duke of Beaulieu, Lord Montagu, and she had worked during the war in Switzerland with the OSS, with the predecessor of the CIA. And she was there as the point person for Carol Reed, the director, in Vienna. There's also a fourth person who's really important in terms of espionage, and that is a guy called Peter Smollett, or, to give him his original name, Peter Smolka, who was Viennese, who had worked for the War Information Department in Britain at the beginning of the war, but was an NKVD agent. So he was an agent for the Russians. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that this is the height of Cold War crisis, the Berlin airlift, but they were able to film in the Russian zone, which is the Prater, the place where the big wheel is. So the actual bit when they're going around and you have that key scene between Orson Welles and Joseph Cotten, that's actually filmed in Shepperton Studios here in London. But the lead up to it is filmed in the Prater Park in Vienna, which was very much under the control of the Russians. And it is believed that it was Smolka, Peter Smollett, who was able to persuade the Russians to allow them into the second district in order to film there. Just one other tiny thing which is hinted at by some people about espionage. One of the young British spies in Vienna at the time was a woman named Dorothy Park, who became notorious later on in the early 60s for being the British operative involved in the murder of Patrice Lumumba in the Democratic Republic, what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. And Dorothy Park was stationed in Vienna at the time, and she was involved in a very complex operation, putting down surveillance technology to find out what the Russians were up to in their districts. And there are some people who suggest that Dorothy Park was involved in persuading some of the members of the filming team when they went into the second district to do some surveillance in order to find out how she could listen into what the Russians were saying. So this was not just a movie, it was part of everything that was going on in Vienna at the time. I mean, Vienna is one of the main actors in this film. Vienna was, until 1918, the capital of an empire which had existed for over 500 years, which was a huge part of Europe, stretching in the end from Lemberg, Lviv, up in what is now Ukraine, down into Italy. And after the defeat of the Central Powers in the First World War, 1918, this magnificent imperial capital suddenly turned overnight into the capital of a piss little country in the center of Europe with 6.5 million people that nobody cared about. And Vienna has ever since then, since 1918, tried to understand what its role, this once glorious capital where the architecture remains it's still magnificent to this day. What is its function? A huge imperial capital, but presiding over a tiny country. And it experienced the sense of destruction that it felt in 1918 once again in 1945. And so what you're seeing in Vienna is both an authentic picture of what the city looked like in 1948. The Battle of Vienna, which took place in March 1945, March and April 1945, killed 100,000 people. It was a very big battle, but many people don't know about it. It came in the immediate wake of an even bloodier battle, which was the Battle for Budapest. And so what you had there in 1948 was a grand capital of despair. And Greene and Carol Reed in particular recognized the value of that contrast between grand imperial and utter devastation.
I want to come back to the espionage question because there are lots of theories that circulate around this film. But on Vienna, it's a haunted city in this film, and it's also weirdly empty. So in a lot of the scenes, the great squares, there's no one around. Not just in the Russian zone, but in the international zone. And the sewers are running underneath, so there's an implication there. I don't know if it's a crude metaphor, but the thought that there is a darker history underneath this city. Every time, I'm sure it's true of you, I haven't seen it nearly as many times as you have, but you notice different things. So there's a line in it that I hadn't noticed before. When Kurtz, Heart of Darkness Kurtz, Baron Kurtz, early on, Holly Martin says to him, they say that Harry Lime is a racketeer. And he says, well, I mean, we're all racketeers. We all have to sell cigarettes to survive. Before the war, we would be horrified to think of the things that we're doing after the war. But he doesn't mention the war. And there is that question about this nation that's being portrayed as a victim of Nazism, actually complicity.
Yeah.
And there is, to me, in the film, there's a deep buried resonance of the complicity of this haunted city.
Which is really the history of post-Second World War Austria, is they were given a free pass by the Allies when the Allies, for their own pragmatic reasons and wanting to divide Austria from Germany, said that Austria was the first victim. And that was inscribed into the State Treaty in 1955, when, unlike in Germany, which remained divided, both the Soviet Union and the Americans and the British and the French agreed that Austria, they would stop occupying Austria, it would become free and independent, but it would be recognized as the first victim of the Nazis, and secondly, it would be neutral in perpetuity. So that means you take Austria out of the Cold War game. And incidentally, it's another reason why it retains its image as the city of spies. So what are the references, as you refer to the Second World War? Well, there are very subtle references. There's that bit at the end, which I find incredibly moving, of the balloon salesman who comes in at this moment of great tension. And that salesman is clearly Jewish. And it is, this moment of incredible poignancy because that character has emerged out of some hell that he's been living in for 5 years, obviously protected by somebody. And it's a reminder of what Vienna once was, which was a very, very multinational, multi-confessional city, which has now become this city filled with people like Baron Kurtz and Dr. Winkel. Winkel. And the other reference at the end, which is, it's perhaps coincidental, but knowing the information they had, I'm not sure it was the cafe where the setup is at the end for Harry Lime's arrest, is the Mark Aurel Cafe. And the Mark Aurel Cafe is in Mark Aurel Strasse in Vienna. at whose end stood the Hotel Metropole, which was the Gestapo headquarters during the Second World War and is known to be a living hell for people who entered into the Hotel Metropole. And it's a nod to the fact that Vienna is a cankered city in many ways. Incidentally, the sewer, which we see at the end, much of the sewer is not actually the sewer in Vienna. It's the Vienna River, the Wienfluss, which runs underneath much of Vienna. But Orson Welles did not want to film in the sewers.
In the actual sewer.
In the actual sewers. And you notice, one of the things you said, you notice something every time. And this time what I notice is the rats in the sewers only appear in the scenes with Holly Martins, with the Joseph Cotton character. They don't appear when Orson Welles is around. And one of his great objections was he didn't want to be anywhere near rats.
One of the reasons that Kurtz and Winkel are so sinister, and they really are sinister, is they have that look of mock innocence about them, like they've got away with something. We've been declared victims. Would you believe it?
Yes.
We've been declared victims. Us?
Yes. Little old me. Kurtz is in particular. I mean, Winkel, you know, from the minute you see him, Winkel is a really nasty piece of work, and also Popescu as well. Don't forget Popescu. But Kurtz does that sort of oleaginous.
I've fallen on hard times. I'm having to play my violin to make a living.
Poor old me. I think one of the things that is often unrecognized in this film is the minor characters, who for me inhabit an entire universe of their own. So the guy who plays the concierge was Paul Herbiger. The Herbiger family was acting royalty in Austria. And for me, his performance is absolutely magnificent. When they showed the film in the United States and the United Kingdom on its release in 1949, there were no subtitles at all. So it was like you saw it this evening. The Austrian dialogue, it's all in very pronounced Austrian dialect, which is how they all speak. It's how the middle class and the upper class speak as well, as in Germany. People retain their, regardless of class, they retain their regional dialect. And he gives a magnificent performance. The little boy who identifies...
Yeah, speaking of creepy characters.
So speaking of creepy characters, but he's, you know, again, utterly authentically Austrian as well. I mean, the language is entirely Austrian. He's doing that. And Anna Schmidt's Hausmeisterin, the concierge for Anna Schmidt's place, that performance is comic genius. And the one, but unfortunately, you sort of need to understand German to understand it. But she does this wonderful thing when all the police come in and start searching her apartment. The line she says is that, you know, police in this apartment, she says, this used to be a place where princes came and enjoyed themselves. And then she said, if this was Austrian police, I could believe it. But these are all foreigners. One thing I can tell you, I imagine liberation to be something very different from this. And it's like, it's just, it's magic. And even things like Crabbin, the sort of British council type character, who's played by Wilfrid Hyde-White. I mean, marvellous performance by Wilfrid Hyde-White, in my opinion. Don't know if you noticed, but his wife, who doesn't say a thing, there's a little drama going on the whole time with him and his wife. So in every scene, almost in that film, you've got something new to explore and to examine.
It was written by Graham Greene. One of the espionage theories that circles around this film is to do with the title. So Graham Greene worked for Philby during the war. Graham Greene knew Philby at this time. Philby, of course, was the third man. In the early 1960s, after Burgess and Maclean, there were questions in Parliament demanding that the identity of the third man be revealed. Now, it can't be the case, I think, that the third man in the title of this film is a reference to Philby because it's too...
It can't.
But if you go online, you'll find all sorts of people saying, actually, this film is Graham Greene warning Philby that if he doesn't watch out, he will be identified as the third man. So part of the legend of this film is the title. It's an extraordinary piece of good fortune because it comes to have this complete... I assume the title is just the reference that it has in the film, and yet it comes to mean something very different.
So Kim Philby in 1934, this is where it was in Vienna. So in 1934, late 1933, the First Republic, the Democratic Republic, is overthrown by Austrian fascists who are anti-Nazi, anti-German, but they are fascists, led by somebody called Engelbert Dollfuss. And when Dollfuss takes over with a coup, there is resistance on the part of the Social Democrats and the Communists. And this resistance lasts about 3 months or so, but it's a civil war. And the final battle of the Civil War takes place in the social housing block in Vienna, which was the iconic social housing block. So Vienna in 1920 entered the phase of what's called Red Vienna. It was run by Social Democrats, rest of Austria largely run by Christian social stroke fascists. But Vienna was a holdout for social democracy, and the housing policy which they started in 1920 pertains to this day, which is why Vienna has the cheapest housing in Europe, that over 60% of people in Vienna live in some form of subsidized housing. It is a monumental achievement, and the model social housing in Vienna that was built in the 1920s was the Karl Marx Hof, the Karl Marx courtyard. And the culmination of the Civil War in 1934, in February 1934, was a pitched battle between the communists and the Social Democrat militia, the Schutzbund, and the military of Dollfuss and the Austro-fascist regime. And in the middle of the Karl Marx Hof during this is one Kim Philby. And what Philby is doing is he is extracting communists. He's already been turned by the NKVD. He's extracting communists from the Karl Marx Hof while it's under attack and getting them passage out of Austria and into a safe place in the West. And the other person who is knocking around at this time is Peter Smollett, or Smolka as he was then. And there is some evidence that Smolka was involved in recruiting Philby into the NKVD. So this thesis about the third man is not just sheer fantasy. Greene knew who Philby was. He knew Philby. And
he knew Smollett well.
And he knew Smollett. He was quite dismissive of Smollett, although Smollett was responsible for giving him the idea about the penicillin stuff. Smollett had written short stories about Vienna. He and Greene worked together in Vienna, and Smollett gave him a book of his short stories about life in Vienna, and one of them was about the penicillin, and that's where Greene got the idea from. And Smollett was hanging around the set for much of the time, as was Elizabeth Montagu, who was, one thinks, also clocking Smollett. I mean, it's a really, really sort of intricate...
it was an intricate small world. One other detail, small world of writers. Smollett is thought to be the person who went around London warning off publishers against publishing Animal Farm.
That's absolutely right. And George Orwell had a real animus about Smollett, understandably so. In 1934, when the Austrian Civil War was going on and when the Austro-fascist regime consolidated itself, Smollett emigrated to the United Kingdom, reinvented himself as Peter Smollett Esquire.
Of the Daily Express.
Exactly. And he,
where all good Soviet agents go to ply their trade.
And became a sort of dandy around town, although he was not a terribly attractive man physically.
So one of the questions about this film is, whose film is it? So it does have, of course, one of the great film-stealing performances by Orson Welles. And some people think, because of the look of the film, because of the way it's shot, some of the camera angles, they see Citizen Kane in it, the look of it, they feel it's an Orson Welles film. Other people, and I incline a bit towards this, I see Graham Greene in it in lots of places, including, I have to say, in the relationship between Anna and Harry Lime, which I think is the weakest part of the film, and it's weak in a Graham Greene kind of way. There's something forced about it. I don't actually believe in it, and it reminded me a little of the relationship between Rose and Pinky in Brighton Rock, another racketeer and gangster with his girl. The girl knows that he's evil, but she can't break away from him. But it's also a Carol Reed film. So whose film is it?
So Carol Reed and Graham Greene had collaborated on a film prior to this, which was The Fallen Idol. And I think The Fallen Idol is a very good film, in my opinion. And The Fallen Idol is also about perception. It's seen through the eyes of a young boy, and his hero, the butler, who lives with him in his house. The young boy is from a very privileged upper middle class family, and his only real friend is the butler. The butler has a difficult relationship with his wife, and the wife slips from a big staircase and dies, and the little boy thinks that the butler pushed her. And so the little boy has this terrible dilemma. His great hero, Baines, had murdered his wife, and he couldn't quite reconcile this. And actually, I think Joseph Cotten plays the same role with Holly Martins.
As the boy.
Exactly. Joseph Cotten is the naive kid who adores Harry Lime. Harry Lime is always the kid who did everything at school. It was successful. He gets away with everything, and Holly's left holding the baby, as it were, metaphorically. So there were elements of that collaboration in The Fallen Idol, which I see in The Third Man. But you have this extraordinary camera work in The Third Man. Now, this was the only Oscar that The Third Man won, which was for cinematography, which was Robert Kasker, who was the Australian cinematographer. And a lot of people thought that this was actually Welles influencing it because it had elements of Citizen Kane in it, and later on elements of Touch of Evil and films like that. But actually, Welles said, I actually didn't do much about this film. He was only in Vienna for 11 days. One of the reasons why we see so little of him is because he didn't want to be there. And what's really interesting is that this film had been cast, first of all, by Carol Reed, with Cary Grant as a Holly Martins, or Rollo Martins, as he is in Graham Greene's novel version of the book, and with Noel Coward as Harry Lime. And when he brought David O. Selznick in as the American producer, in order to get, Selznick says, no way are we having Cary Grant and Noel Coward. Selznick gave Joseph Cotten, he was contracted to Selznick's studio at the time, and said part of the deal is that you can have Joseph Cotten as your lead for free, so they didn't have to pay for it. And then it was Corder and Carol Reed who turned around and said, well, we'd like Orson Welles as Harry Lime, because Noel Coward had turned it down. And Selznick said, under no circumstances are you having Orson Welles, because by this time he was box office poison. But Carol Reed and Corder went ahead and insisted and did it. And that combination, because although Orson Welles puts in the performance of a lifetime, in my opinion, as Harry Lime, you don't see him very much. And Cotton has to carry a lot of this film together with Trevor Howard. Trevor Howard's fresh out of Brief Encounter. And to switch from Brief Encounter to Calloway, I think just demonstrates what a fabulous actor Trevor Howard was.
And yet to be pure Trevor Howard in both.
And exactly, and yet utterly recognizable. But in terms of your Anna Schmidt thing and Vale's performance, so I believe in that relationship more than you do. And why do I think that is because I've known people in my life who just believe that somebody who they've fallen in love with have something out of the ordinary which somehow allows them to forgive them for their sins and their evil deeds. And she's a woman who's on the run. You know, she's a Czech or a Slovak. We don't know whether she's Czech or Slovak, but she's on the run. The Russians are after her. And this guy comes along who is just so entertaining, so charismatic that she doesn't care because she's surrounded by people who are all vile. She sees the world as vile. And he's the one person who makes her laugh.
And so if children die, children die.
And if children die, children die, because remember, she comes from Czechoslovakia, and she's been through the war. Everyone thinks, everyone dies at this stage. Yeah. Incidentally, this is the only time that the novel is published after the movie. Carol Reed approached Greene after The Fallen Idol and said, I want to make something in Vienna, post-war Vienna, and I want you to write the script. And Greene had already written a sort of sketch of a story where he starts by saying, I saw Harry Lime the other day in the Strand 3 years after he died. Greene says this was a sentence and apparently it was based on a real life experience of Greene's when he saw somebody on the Strand who he thought was dead, and there he was. And Reed asks him to write the film script, and Greene responds by saying, I can't write film scripts, I only write novels. And so what he wrote was a dense treatment of the third man, and it was the collaboration with people like Smollett, Elizabeth Montagu, and one or two others that turned that into a script. And then Greene takes what happens in the film and turns that into the novel with one or two curious mistakes or differences. Anna Schmidt, for some reason, is Hungarian in the novel. She's not Czechoslovak. And I don't know why that would be. And also that fabulous scene when he's giving the embarrassing talk to the British Cultural Association.
Which should be said is pure Hitchcock, that bit, I think.
That is pure Hitchcock. In the novel, it's different. It's Calloway and his men who come after him in that scene, and not Popescu and the thugs. It is pure Hitchcock, actually, with the parrot as well. And that is... I think my favorite line of all is, I was bit by a parrot, oh, never mind. And Calloway saying...
One of the ways in which it strikes me, it's a Graham Greene view of the world. So the reviews were generally positive, but the Daily Worker hated the film. And the Daily Worker hated the film because it says, like all these films, it's a brutal and miserable portrayal of the Soviets as evil and sinister. So I looked at it and thought, really? I mean, actually, okay, Harry Lime is in the Russian zone and being protected, but the Soviet commissar in the international zone is a sort of smooth operator, but there's nothing particularly sinister about him. In all Graham Greene fiction, the Russians are fine. The people you have to be scared of are the Americans.
Yeah.
And the person you have to be scared of most of all is not the evil American, but the innocent American.
Yes.
The innocent American is the person you need to fear. And that, to me, is what makes it feel like a Graham Greene film.
So, exactly. And, of course, the apotheosis of that is the quiet American later
exactly. And
on.
there's a little sort of foreshadowing of that.
Yes,
I think,
and there is. And Brodsky, I agree, the Russian Colonel Brodsky is pretty laid back as Russians goes. And he does say to Calloway, he says, I have my orders. Yes. I mean, what can I...
He's not that different from the British soldier who goes to the flat and says, well, it's protocol. Who believes in protocol?
Exactly.
The last thing which we need to mention, because the one thing that Orson Welles did contribute to the film, wasn't in the script, is the cuckoo clock speech, which he semi-improvised, apparently. So it's completely memorable, and it's the one thing everyone remembers about the film. But it's slightly odd and a little jarring to me. And one of the ways it's jarring is that it gives you these two versions of the world, Italy under the Borgias and Switzerland. And the point about Austria is it's neither. Vienna is neither Italy under the Borgias, nor is it Switzerland with 500 years of brotherly love. It's like a line. I mean, it fits the fact that Wells breezed in, wouldn't go into the sewers, was around for 11 days, steals the film, and comes up with the one line that everybody remembers. But it is incongruous in a film that is haunted by Austrian and Viennese history, I think.
Yeah, but of course, as you say, it's the line that everyone remembers. It's interesting, it was improvised. He said later on, Wells, that he'd heard it as a joke from somebody 3 or 4 years earlier, and he just thought it was such a good joke that he wanted to...
So I'll use it in some film.
I'll use it in yes. Obviously, it wouldn't quite have worked in Touch of Evil, or might have worked in Kane, who knew? I guess it is incongruous, but it's such a good line. And if you look at that scene before he comes up with it, because that's the culmination of the scene, but that scene is a masterclass in acting from Wells when he's going around on the Praterstand on the big wheel, because you can see when Joseph Cotton, when Holly Martins turns around and looks at him, he immediately has this smile on his face back to the old times in the high school. And the minute that Cotton turns away, he puts on his sinister face. And he does it with timing that is so perfect. It's really worth watching that particular scene very slowly, because it shows Wells at his most sinister and attractive best at the same time. It's a masterpiece of cinema, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. The other way that it struck me as being a Graham Greene novel was there's all this talk of God and heaven and hell. They're in the underworld for a lot of the movie. They have this conversation about whether Orson Welles believes in God when they're up in this circular thing. And there's the porter who says heaven and points down and hell and points up. In that sense, I wondered if the speech he gives fits in a kind of Nietzschean sense, in that this is a world in which there is no God, men are trying to work out what to do, and Orson Welles is a character who thinks you need creative destruction to have artistic merit and aesthetic prowess.
It's a big question. So one of the ways it's not quite like the other Green things is, though clearly this is a Catholic city, the Catholicism is not central. So it is general talk of God rather than, say, Brighton Rock, which only makes sense if you think of it as a novel about Catholicism.
Yeah, the only thing you have is the beginning and the end is the Catholic last rites in the funeral. So almost the opening scene and almost the last scene are mirrors of each other. But I don't think religion and belief play a big role in this script of Greene's. But also, I think Vienna is portrayed as a city which, post the Second World War, is beyond heaven or hell. This is a secular nightmare. Vienna is a very, very Catholic city. The one thing that you see it in is the statues. I mean, if you walk around Vienna today or then, it is, along with Prague, one of the great architectural homes of the Counter-Reformation. And you have the greatness of God shoved into your face in every square. And that, I think, is, again, you see that in the filming. There are often those pictures of statues and grand religious symbols, and lots of them are religious, come up repeatedly throughout the film, from beginning to the end.
And it is set in the international zone, and the international zone is the heart of this great Catholic city with its dark and complicated history. And yet it's being run almost comically by this international police force, who clearly, there is no moral code there. This is just a sort of glimpse of a new world order, which is, it's like a sort of international bureaucracy. trying to contain good and evil in a city where the deep undercurrents so transcend the Frenchman and the British man and the American and the Russian going to arrest this woman. It's sort of like the Keystone Cops version of the United Nations.
But you know what happened in Vienna? So Vienna comes under Allied control, under Russian control, actually, in late March, early April, 45. Within 3 weeks of the occupation, the Russians are performing Tchaikovsky in the Staatsoper, in the State Opera. The British are bringing in troops to play Shakespeare. You've got the French having Racine being performed in their district, and you have the Americans having jazz bands and so on. The cultural swamping of Vienna from 1945 to 1955 was an extraordinary thing to behold. And this was very different from the experience in Berlin, where everything was so tense because the Cold War was focused on that. It's almost like, for the four powers, Austria is a sort of comic opera, and you should never take Austria that seriously. And yet, at the same time, there is the undercurrent of violence, of deceit, and of criminality, and of espionage, which pertains in Vienna and Austria to this day, although it's much less noticeable than it was, but it's still there.
It's not going to be a Nietzschean question, but
all the better for it.
You haven't mentioned the music, and I think the music is kind of
my God,
character in the film, isn't it?
Let me tell you about Anton Karas. So Anton Karas is basically, he's playing in a Heuriger. So Vienna, you may not know it, is surrounded by vineyards. And it is really, really good wine. The reason why we don't know about it is because in the mid-1980s, there was the so-called Austrian wine scandal because they discovered that some vineyards were putting antifreeze into their wines.
Which is a bit like the penicillin story.
It is, to sweeten it. But around Vienna, they have the most fantastic wines. And in the 19th and 18th district out in the north, you have these places called Heurigers. Comes from the Austrian, specifically Austrian word for this year, which is Heuer. And Heuriger is where you drink this year's wine. And they're marvelous settings. And, you have people dressed in lederhosen and dirndls serving you with big beers and wine and fabulous food and so on and so forth. And Greene and Reed go to a Heuriger in April, May 1948. And there's this itinerant busker, Anton Karas, playing there on the zither. He's actually Croatian. He comes from the Croat part of the Croatia at one point was part of the Austrian Empire, and so his nationality is Croatian, but he's playing this zither in a quite sort of non-Austrian way, but it's and Carol Reed becomes obsessed by it and says, this is the music we want, because the idea before this was that you would have the Vienna waltz and things like that, really the cliches of Viennese music. And Reed approaches him and says, I want you to make the music for a film I'm making. I want you to do the music. And Karas, who was this, very nervous, itinerant musician, didn't know what was going on. But eventually he was convinced, and he was flown to London, and he basically lived in Carol Reed's house for about 2 or 3 months and composed the entire score of the film at Carol Reed's kitchen table. And apparently he hated it. He was terribly homesick. But the Harry Lime theme, which Selznick wanted to get rid of, Selznick was actually quoted saying, lose the banjo. And Carol Reed said, it's not a banjo, it's a zither. So the film came out, and it was a success in London. It was a success in the United States. But the real success was the Harry Lime theme, which was number one in the Billboard Top 100 for 11 weeks after the film came out, and completely transformed this really rather modest and shy musician. He then did concerts all over Europe and America, and I'm very glad to say that A, he had a nice retirement, Anna Garris, but B, this film is regarded almost slightly reluctantly by American critics as one of the great film noirs. It's not American, which is why they say so quite reluctantly, but the use of music in it takes it onto a plane which I don't think has ever been explored before. And one of the reasons why it was so successful, because it goes against type, it goes against what you're expecting.
Could you just say a word or two about Alex Corder, who strikes me as one of the great unsung heroes, particularly in standing up for Carol Reed and helping him protect his vision against Selznick?
Yeah, Alexander Korda, the founder of London Films, Jewish-Hungarian. Korda was the one who brought Selznick in because he needed American money for it. But as you rightly identify, when Selznick tried to intervene, as he did frequently, Korda defended Carol Reed and allowed Carol Reed to edit it in the way that he wanted to. One of the bones of contention was Kaska's cinematography, that Selznick didn't like, in particular, the angles. There are so many shots which are at an angle. There are very few shots which are straight. But the one thing where Selznick intervened and Korda allowed him to intervene was the ending of the film, because Graham Greene wrote it as a happy ending, and Graham Greene's ending was Joseph Cotten, Holly Martins going off with Anna Schmidt with her arm in arm, and they walk off to a bright future. And Selznick,
so another implausible relationship.
And Selznick says no, and Selznick suggested that she just walks. And along with the Orson Welles line about the cuckoo clock, that final shot became an iconic moment in film history, where, because Americans like the resolution so much and they like happy endings, it was seen as quite dramatic and dark at the time. So if you compare it with a film, for example, like Casablanca, which was a highly political film, in my opinion, in as much the Bogart represents initially American isolationism, and the film is about America coming to realize that you have to fight the Nazis. It nonetheless, even though he loses the girl and hands over his ticket for the girl to go to Lisbon with Ingrid Bergman, Elsa with Victor Laszlo, you have that fabulous ending of him and Claude Rains going off into the distance and him saying, "Louis, I think this is the beginning of a big friendship." And Selznick said, no, we're not going to do it that way. And that final shot, which is incredible because it's well over a minute, which in film terms is an eternity, nonetheless, I think you just get gripped by it. And as she walks past and he sits there and lights a fag, you have that sense that this is like life, because there is no resolution in life. There is ambiguity and there is despair.
The penultimate film in our season at the Regent Street Cinema is coming up soon. It's happening on Wednesday, May the 20th. There are just a few tickets left, but we would love to see you there. I'm going to be talking to the writer and journalist Helen Lewis about Good Night and Good Luck, George Clooney's film about the journalist Ed Murrow and his fight with Senator McCarthy and McCarthyism. If you'd like to get tickets, you know what to do. Click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com, and go to our events page. Next time, we are returning to our series that we're calling Where Are We Going?, about some of the big questions facing the future for all of us. I'm going to be talking to the journalist and author Sarah O'Connor about the past, present, and future of work. She's been writing about the changing character of work for nearly 20 years, and we're going to be exploring whether it is all about to change for good. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.